in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Okay, good evening. It is time to finish off this chapter and this section, actually, in the Occult A History. I left off in the middle of a chapter last time, so we'll finish it up tonight. It'll be, relatively short. So, we left off at the end of a very long, like page and a half long quote. Longer than that. Oh, but anyway, so here we go. Jump right on into it. Seabrook quotes Gurdjieff as saying, quote, "If we live calm, monotonous days and peaceful nights, we stultify. We had better torture our own spirit than suffer the inanities of calm." End quote. He adds, quote, "His disciples therefore were awakened at all hours of the night suddenly and had learned to remain frozen in whatever position they had chanced to stand or fall in when leaping out of bed." End quote. The gymnastic exhibitions were not the only part of the displays. There were also tricks that Seabrook describes as being similar to those practiced by Houdini, thought reading, etc. The audience were warned that there would be tricks, half-tricks, and true supernatural phenomena. End quote. Half-tricks, it was explained, depended on an abnormal sensitivity. An object is hidden, and a blindfolded man takes the hands of various people in the room without speaking to them and reads their minds so that he finds the hidden object. In fact, says Gurdjieff, he does not read their minds, but is highly sensitive to the pressure of their hands, which make slight involuntary movements of the muscles, which indicate where the object is hidden. Genuine telepathic phenomena also seemed to occur. A pupil would sit among the audience and be shown some object. He would then telepathically transmit the name and shape of the object to pupils on the stage. Even more startling, the pupil in the audience would transmit to M. de Hartmann, the pianist, the name of an opera, any opera, and he would play an extract from it. An artist pupil sketched animals transmitted by the pupil in the audience. These could, of course, have been tricks, but Gurdjieff himself possessed strong telepathic powers, of which I shall speak in a moment. It may well be that he was able to convey these to some of his pupils. As can be seen from Seabrook's account, the dances were so complex and difficult that they required an almost yogic training. Gurdjieff claimed to have collected them from various Oriental sources, dervishes, Essenes, Buddhists, and so on. Kenneth Walker, in his own account of Gurdjieff, Venture with Ideas, perhaps the finest introduction to Gurdjieff, mentions that the dances involved learning to do different things with different limbs. Anyone who has ever tried rubbing his stomach in a circle and waving the other hand straight up and down will see the difficulty involved here. The dances certainly had the effect of releasing Walker's hidden energies. He records that he often left his Harley Street surgery exhausted, then drove a considerable distance to the Gurdjieff group meeting, but after several hours of exercises, he felt totally wide awake, brimming with energy. Everyone has noticed this phenomenon at some time. No matter how tired you are, some sudden excitement or crisis can snap you into full alertness. We possess two types of will. I have elsewhere used the illustration of a bullet. The bullet is driven by an explosion of cordite. But the cordite, although powerful, is quite harmless and inexplosive on its own. At the end of the bullet there is a tiny cap of a substance called mercuric fulminate, which explodes instantly on contact. The hammer of the gun explodes the fulminate, and the fulminate explodes the more powerful cordite. Man possesses a fulminate will and a cordite will. If I am doing some routine job like mowing the lawn, I use my cordite will, but it burns rather dully. If something really excites me or arouses my sense of urgency, it is the fulminate will that explodes, and that produces a roar of power from the cordite will. The fulminate will is tied up with the imagination and sense of purpose, and these in turn detonate my ordinary willpower and vitality. How's my sound? Everything good? Okay. But sudden emergency is not necessary to produce the same effect. Any hard and unusual work causes me to warm up until finally my consciousness broadens. This is the basis of Gurdjieff's disciplines. Gurdjieff's system is highly complex, but there would be no point in trying to summarize it here. Planets are regarded as living beings. Different worlds exist on different levels of materiality. This sounds like Madame Blavatsky, and have different vibrations. Man's chief business is actually to produce a kind of psychological vibration that feeds the moon. Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, one of the most thorough expositions of Gurdjieff's ideas, is full of tables of octaves, worlds, triads, elements, and so on. It is an interesting but not important question whether Gurdjieff learned this during his travels, or whether he invented it as a kind of framework for the theoretical side of his system. He speaks of several centers in all: intellectual, emotional, moving or physical, instinctive, sexual, and two more called higher thinking and higher emotional. He explains that the centers tend to work with one one another's energies and take over one another's functions. Quote, "It is a very great thing when the sex center works with its own energy," end quote. It then becomes akin to the higher emotional center. Everyone can understand this statement. For example, D.H. Lawrence's description of the gradual improvement in the sexual relation between Mellors and Lady Chatterley show the sex center learning to use its own energy instead of working on emotional or, worse still, thought energy. When the sex center works with its own energy, sympathy and tenderness are involved. Sex ceases to be a kind of mutual masturbation. But then, if anyone takes the trouble to analyze this statement phenomenologically, he will see that it is untrue. Sex can be bad because my mind is elsewhere, because I am worried, because, in short, I am involved in a world of fantasies. When I am properly balanced, when my mind is aware of objective reality, sex is likely to produce maximum intensity and insight. However, this is unimportant. We may take a skeptical view and say simply that Gurdjieff was a psychologist of singular brilliance and insight on a level with Nietzsche. The important thing is that he grasped the basic problem and tried to remedy it. The core of his system concerns levels of consciousness. Man has potentially 4 states of consciousness, says Gurdjieff. First of all, there is sleep, when you are wrapped in your own private world. Then there is waking consciousness, or so-called waking consciousness, which you appear to share with other people. But we are not really sharing a common consciousness. We each remain wrapped in our own blanket of subjective fantasy, and into this semi-sleeping state there burst occasional moments of intensity consciousness, when we seem to wake up. Gurdjieff calls this self-remembering. He demonstrates by a simple exercise how difficult this is to achieve. If you close your eyes, you sink into a subjective inner world in which you think only of yourself. If you look at your watch when someone asks you the time, you forget yourself and become aware only of your watch. But try looking at your watch and also being aware of yourself looking at it. You will find that you can only do this very briefly. After a moment, your attention slips, and you either forget your watch and become aware only of yourself, or forget yourself and become aware only of the watch. All the moments that we remember for the rest of our lives, the moments of sudden intense happiness or moments of self-remembering, I seem to wake up and have a feeling of, what, me, here? I am as aware of the place as of myself being in it, and such states may last for half an hour or so. Beyond self-remembering, there is a 4th state called objective consciousness. That is, a constant state in which the mind actually perceives objective reality all the time. This is seldom or ever This is seldom or ever achieved by human beings, even in flashes. One of the chief aims of the work, either manual labor or dancing, was to induce increased self-consciousness, the possibility of achieving self-remembering for long stretches. In my own terminology, habit leads the robot to economize on the energy it sends up to my conscious mind. This in turn leads my conscious mind to find life rather dull. In fact, the dullness is inside me. But I think that the world itself is to blame, so I allow my consciousness to become even duller and lazier. This means that the robot sends even less energy, and so the vicious circuit continues. If, on the other hand, I can somehow induce in myself a state of optimistic expectation, I cause the robot to pour more energy into consciousness, and the more energy he releases, the more the world strikes me as delightful and interesting. If I'm at all self-observant, I will also recognize that this state of wide awakeness, intense aliveness, is due to effort on my part. Once I clearly grasp this, the old vicious circle whereby we can get used to anything is broken. It could be quite permanently broken, and then a new form of man would appear. Gurdjieff's system was based upon the same insight as Freud's and Edmund Husserl's. that although man appears to himself to be a very simple, straightforward being, a mirror-like consciousness, he is actually an immensely complex machine with many levels. Like the top gear in a car, consciousness is our weakest level. It is unfortunately the only level that many of us are aware of. Our real strength lies on other levels. The evolutionary problem is for us to become aware of these other levels. The essence of personal evolution is the actual heat generated by mental effort. Gurdjieff distinguishes between what he calls personality and essence. Most actors have a great deal of personality because they take the trouble to develop it, but it is only a surface layer. Essence is inner strength, true personality. Gurdjieff says that one of the few men he had ever known who possessed true essence was a Corsican brigand who used to spend all day peering down the sights of his rifle in the hot sun, waiting for passing travelers. The strength and endurance caused that inner fusing called essence. 2 years after meeting Gurdjieff, Ouspensky had begun to develop the mental muscles for longer periods of self-remembering. To begin with, his efforts at self-remembering had tended to slip into total forgetfulness. He speaks of a long effort at self-remembering as he walked through Petrograd, and the strange emotional state of inner peace, this is quote, and the quote, strange emotional state of inner peace and confidence that comes after great efforts of this kind, end quote. And then of suddenly waking up 2 hours later and remembering that he has completely forgotten to remember himself. Here it can be seen that the plunge from a higher form of consciousness to a lower one is exactly like a blackout. In the summer of 1916, the quote-unquote miracle began to happen. He describes it in Chapter 13 of In Search of the Miraculous. In a house in Finland, after a session during which he had been savagely sarcastic to everyone, including Ouspensky, Gurdjieff suddenly began to speak to Ouspensky telepathically. Quote, I heard his voice inside me as if it were in the chest near the heart, end quote. Gurdjieff put questions without speaking. Ouspensky answered them, and it continued for half an hour. The experience also demonstrated to Ouspensky's satisfaction that Gurdjieff was by no means infallible, in spite of his occult knowledge. After 2 hours of walking in the forest, struggling with conflicting emotions, Ouspensky says, quote, I saw that Gurdjieff was right, that what I had considered to be firm and reliable in myself in reality did not exist, but I had found something else. I knew that he would not believe me and that he would laugh at me if I showed him this other thing. But for myself, it was indubitable, and what happened later showed I was right, end quote. Later, in bed, Gurdjieff's voice again spoke in his chest, and Ouspensky replied mentally. They carried on a conversation from different parts of the house. The following morning at breakfast, the mind-reading act continued. Ouspensky began to brood on a problem about the quote-unquote ray of creation. Gurdjieff told him, speaking normally, to leave it for now because it was too far ahead. Ouspensky says that he was in a strange emotional state for 3 days, and although Gurdjieff told him that he was now no longer asleep, he felt this to be untrue. He was undoubtedly asleep at times. What had happened is that long effort had broken through to Ouspensky's psychic faculties, the red end of the spectrum. This is why he felt that he had not achieved full wakefulness. On the way back to Petrograd, Ouspensky, alone in the compartment, not only talked to Gurdjieff but saw him, and back in Petrograd, Ouspensky had the impression of seeing sleeping people, quote unquote. Suddenly I saw that the man who was walking toward me was asleep, although his eyes were open. He was walking along, obviously immersed in dreams, which ran like clouds across his face. It entered my mind that if I could look at him long enough, I could see his dreams. After him came another, also sleeping. A sleeping Izvoshchik, cab driver, went by with 2 sleeping passengers. Suddenly I found myself in the position of the prince in The Sleeping Princess. Everyone around me was asleep." End quote. After a few weeks, this strange state passed off, and Ouspensky returned to normal consciousness. This again demonstrates that what he had experienced was not true waking consciousness, although it was certainly more awake than everyday consciousness. It was some kind of accidental return to jungle sensitiveness, to the occult faculty of animals. But as a result of this period, he also reached new depths of intuition. He explains his sudden clear perception that violent means to achieve anything whatever are always a mistake. They always produce negative results. This is not, he says, a moral conclusion, like Tolstoyan non-resistance, but a practical one. This is obviously the reason for Gurdjieff's patiently creative attitude in his personal relations, the refusal to give way to the impulse to destroy or dismiss. I would beg to differ on that there is never any, no, bullshit. That it's always a mistake, that violent means to achieve anything, whatever, are always a mistake. Achieving staying alive when somebody's trying to kill you requires violence, and that is not a mistake. So I would say that he's going a little beyond on that one. Anyway, the revolution forced Gurdjieff to leave Russia. No doubt he would have been liquidated, quote unquote, fairly quickly as an organizer of secret groups. In London, Ouspensky himself began to teach groups that he had learned what he had learned from Gurdjieff, and his group finally provided the money for Gurdjieff to buy the building in Prairie. Ouspensky and Gurdjieff had ceased to work together. In fact, there was a total opposition of temperament. Ouspensky was a scientist by nature, dry, precise, abstract, although this is not to say that he was a mere intellectual. Gurdjieff was a Walt Whitman-esque type of character, in some ways not unlike Rasputin. He was not a saint. He liked good food and drank a lot of Armagnac. I've never even heard of that. Armagnac. I'll have to look it up. When he was settled in Fontainebleau, he moved in his mother, brother, and sister, and the anonymous author of the journal remarks that he was a patriarchal figure. An aphorism on the wall in the study house said, quote, "It is a sign of a good man that he loves his father and mother." End quote. He was, as Orage said, a complete man. When the men bathed communally, they had a ritual of telling dirty jokes, and Gurdjieff would make them line up to examine the degree of sunburn of their behinds. His wife died at Prairie, and Gurdjieff took a mistress, who was soon pregnant. He was apparently capable of sleeping with attractive female pupils, and I myself have met a professor at an American university who told me he was one of Gurdjieff's natural sons, and by no means the only one. In God Is My Adventure, Ram Landau tells the story of an American woman novelist who sat next to Gurdjieff's table in a restaurant. Gurdjieff suddenly began to inhale and exhale in a peculiar way, and the woman went pale. She said that she had caught Gurdjieff's eye. Quote, "I suddenly felt as if I had been struck right through my sexual center. It was beastly." End quote. Even Crowley did not possess the capacity to cause instantaneous orgasms in strange women. Landau also mentions that he stumbled upon proof that Gurdjieff had been in Tibet. An Arab writer, Ahmed Abdullah, said he had met Gurdjieff in Lhasa, when Gurdjieff was an agent of the Russian secret police. Okay. Um, on his return to France after his American trip, Gurdjieff had a serious motor accident that almost killed him. There was something odd about his accident. Fritz Peters had described Gurdjieff as an insane driver who would not last 2 minutes on a modern road. Before leaving Paris for Prairie, he told Madame de Hartmann to order the mechanic to carefully check his car. He was peculiarly insistent. He then told her to take a train back to Prairie instead of coming with him. No one knows exactly what happened. A passing gendarme found the wrecked car by the side of the road, and Gurdjieff, badly injured, lying beside it, covered with a blanket, with his head on a pillow. The gendarme said it seemed impossible that a man so badly injured could have moved that far. Only Gurdjieff's fantastic vitality saved his life. Had he somehow foreseen the accident, or was it in some odd sense deliberate? He was not actually an accident-prone man. Or not usually an accident-prone man, sorry. On the other hand, neither was he a Superman. Fritz Peters describes a trip to Vichy, Vichy, I don't know, with Gurdjieff driving. Gurdjieff insisted on driving too fast on the wrong side of the road. Peters was supposed to map read, but Gurdjieff went so fast that they usually shot past turnings. He always refused to turn back, so they had to find new routes all the time. He declined to stop for petrol and would drive until the car ran out. Then one of the two boys had to walk to the nearest garage and bring a mechanic, too, since Gurdjieff was convinced that it could not be mere lack of petrol that had made the car stop. It is not clear why he didn't keep a can of petrol in the boot. He always arrived at hotels so late that they had to knock the proprietor up. In the Vichy Hotel, his behavior was wildly eccentric, and he introduced the boys as the sons of Henry Ford and Vanderbilt. Out of this Vichy trip, Vichy, I don't know, Vichy, out of this Vichy trip sprang another curious proof of his occult knowledge. He invited a Russian family to Prairie. They had a daughter. Gurdjieff told the assembled pupils that he would now demonstrate an Eastern method of hypnotism which depended on the subject's susceptibility to music, especially to certain chords. At a certain climactic chord, he said the girl would go into a trance. The Russian family came into the room, and the girl sat beside Gurdjieff. During the music, played by Hartmann at the piano, she was obviously moved, and at the climactic chord seemed to faint. It took a long time to bring her around, and the Russian family were so alarmed that it cost a considerable effort to persuade them to stay. After this, Gurdjieff persuaded the girl to perform the demonstration several times. Peters says that her hysteria when she came out of the trance was too obviously genuine for the whole thing to be a put-up job. Neither is there any need to look for alternative explanations in the case of Gurdjieff. He had learned to push his senses to new limits through various disciplines and studies. As a consequence, he had gained certain occult powers. Whether these powers were of any importance is another matter. Probably he did not think so himself. He differed from all the other magicians we have considered in one obvious respect. He was free from the usual magician's destiny of sudden rise and slow downfall. Compared to him, Paracelsus, Agrippa, Dee, Crowley, Madame Blavatsky seemed to be talented eccentrics, lacking in self-discipline and the sense of self-preservation. The author of the Journal of a Pupil describes a meeting between Gurdjieff and Crowley, but it is clear that they had nothing to say to one another. He says, quote, Crowley had magnetism and the kind of charm that many charlatans have. He also had a dead weight that was somehow impressive, end quote. That is, Crowley was a quote-unquote man of power. Quote, his attitude was fatherly and benign, and a few years earlier I might have fallen for it. Now I saw and sensed that I could have nothing to do with him. End quote. He does not describe the tea except to say that Gurdjieff kept a sharp watch on Crowley and says, quote, I got a strong impression of two magicians, the white and the black, the one strong, powerful, full of light, the other also powerful, but heavy, dull, ignorant, end quote. This seems to be a fair estimate. Gurdjieff's life was controlled, ordered. Perhaps the only quality he shares with most magicians, apart from the natural occult faculty, is the need for disciples. The real difference between the mage and the mystic or saint is that the saint has no business with other people. On the other hand, Gurdjieff insisted that a group of people can achieve more than one person working alone. Ouspensky himself was interested to discover that his own teaching had the curious effect of teaching him things he did not know before. That is to say, his awareness deepened as he taught. This may also have been true of Gurdjieff. Well, that's true of any teacher. You learn more about what you're teaching by teaching it than you do from just learning it. I know that. Gurdjieff called his method the fourth way. The first three are the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, the way of the yogi. That is, the way of physical discipline, the way of emotional discipline, the way of intellectual discipline. The fakir treats his body as the circus ringmaster treats the performing animals. The monk concentrates on prayer, on achieving samadhi through deep love and devotion. The yogi tries to work directly with consciousness, expanding it by certain exercises and disciplines. Gurdjieff sometimes called his fourth way, quote, the way of the cunning man, end quote. But essentially it is a way of knowledge, scientific knowledge. Man must set out to learn and accept nothing on trust. This explains why teaching was so important to Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. How does this differ from the way of yoga? I might put it in this way. At school, I learned to solve mathematical problems by means of log tables or formulae like the binomial theorem. But as often as not, I could not work out the logarithm of a number myself without the tables, or explain to someone how the binomial theorem was invented. So there is a million miles of difference between a clever schoolboy who comes top of the class in mathematics and a mathematical prodigy like Bertrand Russell, who was devouring Euclid for pleasure at the age of 9. The difference is that Russell became a creative mathematician, while the brilliant schoolboy remains merely a competent calculator. Gurdjieff's problem was to convince his pupils of this, that loving and continuous effort put into the work will not only give a man a new degree of freedom, but will make him a creatively free personality, while the fakir, the monk, and the yogi remain somehow statistically free. All the emphasis in his work is laid on the idea of being. He insists that most people do not exist, or hardly exist at all. They are little more than wisps of vapor held together by a body. Asked whether there is life after death, Gurdjieff replied that such wisps of vapor do not survive because there is hardly anything to survive. Asked whether there is such a thing as destiny, Gurdjieff replied that only a person with essence has a destiny. Other people are merely subject to the law of accident. At its simplest level, Gurdjieff's work is an attempt to gain control of one's own life rather than being a leaf tossed around by the wind. At the beginning of the 1914 war, Ouspensky was impressed by the sight of a lorry loaded with crutches for limbs that had not yet been blown off. Such a sight raises the immediate question, but cannot something be done about it? Gurdjieff's reply would strike a social reformer as pessimistic. Nothing can be done because a war is a situation in which several million machines fight several other million machines, reacting helplessly to one another. A criminal or a sex maniac often argues that was carried away by an irresistible impulse, and this is precisely why criminals are among the lowest members of the human race. We are all carried along to some extent. The highest type of human being would be the one who is not a mere leaf in the gale of his emotional reactions. The aim of the work is to put on weight, psychic weight, until you are a heavy stone rather than a leaf, and the wind cannot move you. In her book, The Unknowable Gurdjieff, Margaret Anderson describes how an intellectual woman writer spent only a day at Prairie, asking intellectual questions all the time. The Gurdjieff pupils naturally ignored her request to, quote, put it in a single phrase, end quote, although one of them did say, quote, it is a method for preventing your past from becoming your future, end quote. The woman left in a state of spiteful annoyance, having decided that the whole thing was a bluff. 14 years later, Margaret Anderson met her again and realized that she had not changed in the least. Every word and every gesture was predictable. Her past had become her future, in spite of her intellectuality. On the other hand, the very title of Margaret Anderson's book, The Unknowable Gurdjieff, underlines the chief fault of the Gurdjieff movement, which still exists. Her contention is that Gurdjieff is so profound as to be ultimately unknowable. It was J. G. Bennett, one of Ouspensky's most brilliant followers, who coined the phrase, Gurdjieff is undoubtedly the greatest magician dealt with in this book, but he is not beyond human understanding. Neither is he uniquely original. In his essay, quote unquote, The Energies of Man, William James talks about the phenomena of second wind, why on some days we feel dull and washed out, quote, as though a sort of cloud weighed upon us, end quote, and why this cloud can often be dispersed by deliberately driving yourself to painful effort. The exhausted runner gets second wind, proving that he was not exhausted after all. James also speaks about neurasthenic patients to whom life has become a whole series of insurmountable obstacles, and how a psychiatrist jars them out of it by forcing them to make efforts, which at first are agonizing, and then are succeeded quite abruptly by a feeling of relief. James is pinpointing the problem Gurdjieff deals with, and describes precisely the same course of actions, shocks or abnormal efforts. What is more, James is more deeply concerned with the problem of why our minds get narrower and narrower until life is a series of obstacles. Gurdjieff nowhere analyzes this important problem. Again, in the preface of Back to Methuselah, in a section headed, quote, and the greatest of these is self-control, end quote, Shaw emphasizes that this is the difference between a man and an animal, and in the play itself, he tries to show human beings who have gradually achieved the higher degree of self-control. Shaw goes further than Gurdjieff in believing that this higher degree of self-control would prolong human life indefinitely. That Gurdjieff died at the age of 66 is evidence that he had not acquired a high degree of this self-control. Kenneth Walker warned him a year before that he was eating and drinking too much and would soon be dead if he did not stop. Gurdjieff ignored him. Gurdjieff was a very great man, but he was not unknowable. Neither was his system an unsurpassable ultimate in human knowledge. There are even vital matters upon which he was relatively ignorant. Let me try to define these. The most important realization of all is Husserl's recognition that human consciousness is intentional. As I go through conscious everyday life, I am unaware of the amount of deliberate work I am putting into living. So much of life seems to just happen. So much seems to be given, but I get into a habit of thinking of myself as a passive object acted upon. This is as absurd as if I tried to write with a pen without putting any pressure on the nib. Ask yourself why a holiday often produces an increasing state of positiveness, of optimism and well-being, and the feeling that life is immensely interesting. Because the change makes you put more interest into the act of consciousness, of seeing and doing. Why did Sartre feel so free during the war when he might be arrested at any moment? Because the danger made him feel alert. That is, put more interest into seeing and doing. Normal consciousness is shy and lazy and mole-like, hardly putting any effort into living. We allow habit to tempt us into devaluing experience. It is too easy to forget the values we have fought for. Why does Paris feel such ecstasy as he lies naked beside Helen for the first time? Because he has fought and plotted and schemed for this moment, and now it has arrived. He means to savor it to the last drop. But unless he is a very remarkable person, he will be taking her for granted when he has made love to her 1,000 times. We have to live close up to life to see it from a worm's eye view, and we forget the wider bird's eye view. What can be done about this forgetfulness of existence, to borrow Heidegger's phrase? At the end of All and Everything, Beelzebub tells his grandson that what man really needs is an organ by which he can be constantly aware of the exact date of his own death. This would stop men wasting their lives as if they were immortal. This solution is precisely the same as the one offered by Heidegger in Being and Time. Live with a constant awareness of death. The injunction is useful but not very helpful. Hemingway, for example, tried to live up to it and still died a pathetic alcoholic. To grasp the meaning of intentionality is to grasp the solution. Every moment of intensity consciousness, every Paris in Helen's arms moments, gives us a clear glimpse of the very simple answer. Our normal, more or less bored state of everyday consciousness arises from the habit of devaluing the world. Instead of saying, "How fascinating," we yawn and say, "That's old stuff." But the law of intentionality says that the less you put into perception, the less you get out, and it becomes a vicious downward spiral. There is, however, an important point which without this cannot be fully understood. If someone were to ask me to do a crossword puzzle, I might reply, "No, puzzle. No, crosswords bore me." If he then said, quote, "But this is a special crossword puzzle. Its solution will tell you exactly where £1,000,000 worth of gold is buried in your back garden," end quote, my whole attitude would change, provided, of course, I believed him, or even half believed him. The Paris in Helen's arms moment reveals the objective meaningfulness of the world. It also reveals that consciousness needs not be so barren. Everyday consciousness tends to be narrow because we have to take a worm's eye view of life if we are to be efficient. But we make it worse by a dull, passive, discouraged attitude towards it. It is like having a capacious bag and using it only to carry a single pencil. In moments of intensity, we realize that far more can be got into consciousness. Other times, other places. There is no good reason, for example, why I should not remember my whole childhood as vividly as Proust remembers his when he tasted the Madeleine dipped in tea. Man's trouble is not so much the narrowness of his consciousness, which is important and necessary, as that he lives perpetually on a far lower level of value than the universe merits. Poetry, music, sexual delight, holidays, disappearance of crisis can raise him momentarily to a higher level, but since he is ignorant of the fundamental intentional nature of his response to existence, he tends to fall back into passivity and forgetfulness. At present, his devaluing tendency is unconscious. First of all, he must grasp his devaluing tendency tendency consciously. Then he must begin a conscious, disciplined process of revaluation. I must emphasize that everything depends upon understanding the intentional mechanisms of consciousness. Once these are grasped, you are working in the daylight. Until they are grasped, you are fumbling in the dark. Gurdjieff's remarkable achievement was to understand that most of our limitations are arbitrary, due to habit. William James says, quote, "There seems no doubt that we are each and all of us, to some extent, victims of habit neurosis. We live subject to arrest by degrees of fatigue, which we have come only from habit to obey. Most of us may learn to push the barrier further off and to live in perfect comfort on higher levels of power." End quote. James instances an officer in the Indian Mutiny who performed astonishing feats of endurance when the lives of many women and children were at stake. Now there can be no doubt that all of us would live on a far higher level of vitality if we could choose more interesting and adventurous lives. But the whole point of civilization is to rob life of the element of danger and risk, and we cannot have it both ways. Gurdjieff's discovery was that this is not a real setback. We are intelligent creatures with minds, and we can devise disciplines that are as exciting as any physical danger. These disciplines can make our evolution, which has so far been a matter of accident and natural selection, conscious and deliberate. An interesting problem arises: the black room problem. If where'd I get woman? If a human being is placed in a completely black and silent room, his mind is totally destroyed in a matter of days or weeks. The reason is obvious. Even when surrounded by physical stimuli, our value sense gets eroded too easily. We let ourselves sink into the downward spiral. It is even more so in the black room. Man's habitual negative, devaluing tendency now has the run of his mind, unchecked by sudden bonuses of delight or glimpses of misery and danger that restore the sense of reality. It is like placing a man with a persecution complex among people who do rather dislike him. Man's sense of values is sick and enfeebled. However, this statement should not be taken as an excuse for cultural despair. To diagnose our original sin as clearly as this is to already be within easy marching distance of the solution. Now, it is certain that a Gurdjieff pupil could stand the black room longer than the average person, simply because the neurotic tendencies to self-pity, egoism, destructiveness have been partly erased. But since the Gurdjieff system depends so much on exercises, on work in a purely physical sense, the black room would present a very formidable obstacle. The only final answer to the black room is to develop the value muscle, the ability to pull back and take a bird's eye view. Man becomes godlike not merely through effort, but through values. Gurdjieff's Corsican brigand may possess essence, but that is only the first requirement. Intelligence, imagination, creativity are equally important, and these spring into being from the value sense. How is all this connected with occult faculties? At this point, the answer can be stated with some degree of precision. Faculty X is a vivid sense of the reality of other times, other places. I possess a book of pictures of Cornwall as it was 100 years ago, and to look at the old cobbled streets of Penzance or St. Austell produces in me a kind of shock of wonder, like catching the breath with delight. Suppose we discover some method of taking the mind back into the past, so that I could see the cobbled street in 3 dimensions, and hear the people who walk along it in those days. Suppose someone could invent some occult method whereby I could actually be present at the execution of Charles I, or watch the boy Mozart playing his own concerto to Marie Antoinette, or glimpse the face of Jack the Ripper as he walks under a street lamp. The sense of wonder would now be so intense, the mental energy aroused so enormous, that I would never be the same person again. Deeper levels of my being would be permanently shaken into life, never to fall asleep again. For having glimpsed such wonders, I could never sink back into my previous state of an unwondering sloth. This new sense of wonder would be quite different from Ouspensky's strange excitement during the 3 weeks that he became telepathic. Ouspensky's telepathy happened to him. This intensity would be something I do myself. I would control it by my knowledge. Ouspensky declared that during his telepathic period, he could clearly see the futility of violent methods of achieving anything. Gurdjieff's anonymous pupil said he could instinctively feel that he should not get mixed up with Crowley. The psychic radar begins to operate when the mind overflows with energy, and the mind overflows with energy when its perception of values is clear and intense. The achievement of any degree of faculty X would animate all the so-called psychic faculties, the red end of the spectrum. These occult powers should be a function of the sense of purpose. This does not mean that all the occult faculties would wake up, only those that are important. For a man with a strong sense of purpose, the faculty for avoiding accidents is important, certainly more important than telepathy. Gurdjieff's faculty was apparently inoperative when he drove from Paris to Fontainebleau that day. I am reasonably... I can tell I'm getting tired. I am reasonably convinced that he could, at this point in our evolution, deliberately develop a great many faculties that have so far been accidental. I will give only one example of this. The following is an account of an experiment in willpower conducted by a group that included Professor M. Welford, who teaches psychology at Leicester University. Professor Welford writes, quote, and this is a very long quote again, full page, quote, "In my early 20s, I was systematically reading up as much as possible on chiromancy, divination by means of playing cards, and telepathy. A group of 4, all at Leicester University College, as it then was, all young men and all closely associated for several years at school, and as obsessed bridge players, were involved in the experiment. The 4th person I can't remember, but the 2nd was a friend I had known for 5 or so years, and who eventually shot himself, and the 3rd was a typically volatile, fluent, and amiable Jew, with whom I had very considerable success in fortune-telling by cards and palmistry. 1. A series of cards was dealt face up on a table while the receiver was out of the room. The transmitters agreed with each card which card was to be chosen and brought the subject into the room. He would hold his hand loosely over the cards, eyes shut or open, and allow his hand to move toward the cards at the transmitter's directions, which was given by a series of carefully prearranged sequential directions piecemeal, very like talking a plane down when the pilot is incapacitated or blinded by fog. 2. In a room roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, and full of furniture and other articles, ashtrays, trinkets, pipes, books on shelves and windowsill, the transmitters would sit, having decided upon the objective to be reached while the receiver was out of the room. A typical program would be, quote, pick up the pipe on the coffee table and place it to the left of the vase on the windowsill, end quote. The receiver was brought in and disoriented while blindfolded, and then guided to the target piecemeal, movement by movement as described in 1 above, as though directing a machine, e.g., turn left, stop, move forward, stop, lower left hand, move to right, grasp, lift, and so on. The receiver emptied his mind and remained poised but passive. The transmitters concentrated on projecting the orders as powerfully as possible. The atmosphere was tense, exciting, and strangely still. Exhaustion usually followed. End quote. The chief difference between this and Rhine's experiments with cards is that Rhine's assistants were trying to transmit images, pictures, while Professor Welford's group were trying to transmit orders, impulses. And here it was not a statistical matter, how many times the receiver guessed right, but a matter of immediate and visible results. There is no magic involved, only a faculty that we all possess. This explains the mind-reading part of the demonstrations of Gurdjieff's pupils. Intense work had got them all in tune, awakening their receivers. It also explains the miracle of telepathy between Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. In an ordinary group of more or less skeptical people, the telepathy would not be successful because of a lack of concentration and conviction. The highly complex Gurdjieff exercises broke down this barrier of indifference. The question of why his pupils suffered no damage when they all fell off the stage is even more interesting. If I am deeply and powerfully concerned to perform some action perfectly or to avoid something that I very much want to avoid, I draw a deep breath, so to speak. I prepare to pour energy into the task. In doing most jobs, my boredom level is fairly high. If I'm tightening a nut on a machine, I may waste a great deal of energy because I'm not willing to get up and readjust my position until I'm at the best angle for gripping it with the spanner. In most of my actions, I decide in advance how much energy it is worth putting into it, like a mother telling a child, don't spend more than 5 shillings. Gurdjieff's aim was to force his pupils to pour energy into their dancing, not to economize in any way, to aim at absolute perfection. The vast amount of effort turned the dancing into an instinct, and when an instinct is operating powerfully, the chance of accident is immensely diminished. It is almost as if the stores of poised energy create a psychic armor. The achievement of Gurdjieff was to raise such matters as these from the realm of magic and the occult to the realm of scientific common sense. He did this by creating a framework of psychological knowledge big enough to embrace them all. His influence has not yet made itself felt, but when it does, he will be seen as an innovator of the same rank as Newton, Darwin, or Freud. This section on Gurdjieff would not be complete without some mention of Subud, the religion that was embraced by Gurdjieff's chief English follower, J.G. Bennett. For it was Bennett's assertion that Subud, S-U-B-U-D, was the logical end product of the work, and that its founder, Pak Suba, was the forthcoming avatar, the awakener of consciousness, who is described in All and Everything under the name Ashiata Shamash. It is true that Gurdjieff's Ashiata is described as having lived near ancient Babylon, but Bennett convinced himself that it was intended as a hint of the coming Messiah. In his book concerning Subud, he also describes travels in the East and meetings with sheikhs and holy men who all foretold that he, John Bennett, was to become the English John the Baptist of a new Savior. This is no exaggeration. Bennett apparently believes that Suba is the second coming, heralding the end of the present age in Earth history. Suba, who was born in 1901 in Indonesia, came to England in 1957 and was installed at Bennett's home, Coombe Springs. where a flourishing movement soon sprang up. The film star Ava Bartok, a former Gurdjieff pupil, came there shortly before Suba's arrival, suffering from an internal complaint that necessitated a serious operation. She was pregnant and expected to lose the baby. Suba's wife administered the latihan, a form of meditation, to her without spectacular result. After 19 days, when Miss Bartok was about to enter the hospital for her operation, Suba himself took a hand. Bennett describes the bedroom as, quote, charged with energy that annihilated all personal feeling, end quote, and says that those present had a telepathic experience of fear and physical pain, slowly displaced by growing faith in the power of God. Afterwards, Suba declared that Miss Bartok would not need an operation. Her doctors verified this, and the baby was born normally. The resulting publicity helped to spread Subud throughout the Western world, but Bennett's hope that all Gurdjieff's followers would join Subud was frustrated. Many of them felt, understandably, that the essence of Gurdjieff's system was its logical, scientific nature, and that Suba, whether a genuine avatar or not, had nothing whatever to do with it. The essence of the method, called Subud, Bennett denies that it is a religion or a belief, is the latihan. What is the latihan? It is an opening up of the mind that permits divine energies to perform their work of transformation. Followers of Subud have to be initiated into the latihan by a helper, and at first it has to be taken in a group. Later, after the practice has been established, the latihan can be taken at home. Each latihan lasts about half an hour, and followers of Subud practice it about 3 times a week. I've never heard of Subud. The essence of the latihan is inner stillness, the opening of the heart to meaning. It would seem then that it is simply another name for the basic mystical experience. For example, Powys's ability to somehow enter into the essence of rocks and trees and rocks was a form of the latihan. It is not an exercise or a form of prayer. The only action involved is the initial act of submitting the mind to the force, which should thereafter produce a kind of chemical reaction on the soul. The latihan is not only the basic mystical experience, it is also the basic poetic experience. Wordsworth begins the intimations of immortality, ode by describing a state of inner confusion and discouragement. He then opens his mind to nature, deliberately induces positive consciousness until he can write, "And I again am strong," quote unquote. Suba, a greater spiritual dynamo than Wordsworth, can apparently initiate this state in other people and transmit his own positive consciousness directly. Bennett points out that the latihan differs from ordinary meditation or relaxation exercises in that it does not lead to drowsiness. Like Gurdjieff's exercise, it makes the mind more awake. Poetry has this same effect. Like adding a pinch of yeast to grape juice, an inner ferment begins, a cleansing process. The latihan, then, is one of the basic forms of mystical discipline, perhaps the basic form. The importance of the helper should be clear. The starting point of the latihan is the transcendence of the usual self-division, and this is difficult for a self-divided person without help, without a feeling of definite purpose induced by someone else. For the same reason, it is more difficult to hypnotize yourself than to allow yourself to be hypnotized. Almost there. Last page. Nevertheless, it must be stated clearly that the latihan is not this logical consummation of Gurdjieff's exercises. Gurdjieff aimed as a strengthening of man's true will. His starting point was that there is something wrong with man, as there might be something wrong with any machine, a car or a watch, for instance. The first necessity is to understand the machine. This is not the way of the monk, the fakir, or the yogi, but the fourth way. Gurdjieff calls it, quote, the way of the cunning man, end quote. But it might just as accurately be called the way of the engineer, the man who understands the machine. Suba's way is essentially the way of the saint or monk, the opening of the soul to God. It is the way of Ramakrishna or Sri Rama Maharshi, of Sri Meher Baba. And it has found a more recent exponent in the Maharishi who gained so much influence over the Beatles. It is difficult to see how Bennett, who had known Gurdjieff since 1920 and who regarded him as the most remarkable man he'd ever met, could arrive at the conclusion that Subud is a direct continuation of the work. It is an important alternative road leading in the same direction, but it is not at all the same thing. Gurdjieff was aiming at a kind of yoga for the West, at utilizing the typical Western qualities: scientific analysis, intellectual precision, practical ability, driving energy, for psychological purposes. Subud is essentially a religious method. Gurdjieff himself would have viewed it with the warmest approval, but it would not have taught him anything he did not already know. Bennett himself apparently came around to this opinion. He left Subud 4 years after joining. And that is the end of the chapter and the end of section 2, or part 2 of the book. That leads us into part 3 for next time, which is man's latent powers. And the name of the first chapter, if I can get the page to, is Witchcraft and Lycanthropy. That should be interesting. And I am going to go ahead and I've kept this page. I'm going to look up Armagnac. I'm going to look up that drink. I've never heard of it. So, anyway, that'll be that for this session. I haven't decided if I'm going to game yet or not. I probably will. It's early enough. Play some Greedfall. And I will see you all in that session. Oop, not be right back. Stream ending. Let's try that again. There we go.
Is broken on easily because I have seen apart. I have known about the body. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take. If you leave it behind, someone will break. I left you my heart. What did you do? You left me soft. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know